Hello and welcome to another episode of A Happy Moment. My name is Dan and today we've got Frankenstein. This 1931 movie is based off of a book written by Mary Shelley in the early 1800s. It was actually part of a challenge while she was staying at Lord Byron's to see who could write the better ghost story. Mary won. This movie was directed by James Whale and stars Boris Karloff as the monster, Colin Clive as Dr. Henry Frankenstein, and Mae Clarke as Elizabeth, Henry's love interest. We also have a couple of our Dracula actors in this movie. Edward Van Sloan, who played Van Helsing, is now Dr. Waldman, and Dwight Fry, who played Renfield, is the hunchback assistant Fritz in this movie. Our opening scene is a man walking out on stage and addressing the audience. He warns us that what we're about to witness is rather terrifying. The movie then begins at the site of a funeral. A man has just been lowered into the ground as a group of mourners are gathered around. Lurking in the background are Dr. Frankenstein and his hunchback assistant Fritz. After everybody leaves, they steal the body. They then move on to find the corpse of a hanging criminal and cut him down. We learn Dr. Frankenstein is looking for a brain, but this one won't work because of how the man died. Now we see a medical classroom where a lecture is being given by Dr. Waldman. He's comparing a couple brains. One is a normal brain and the other is an abnormal brain that belonged to a criminal. Once the lecture ends and all the students depart, Fritz sneaks in to steal one of the brains. He grabs the normal one, but a noise startles him and he drops it. So he panics and he grabs the one that's labeled as abnormal. The next day we're introduced to Elizabeth, Henry's fiancée, and Victor, who I wasn't quite clear on this, but I believe he's just a friend of the family in this movie. Elizabeth has received a letter from Henry, and she's concerned because of his mysterious isolation. They decide to go to the university that Henry attended to look for answers. Here they meet with Dr. Waldman, who says Henry was a very advanced student and the university wasn't able to provide him with what he wanted, so he left. Dr. Waldman says Henry was interested in life and death of humans. Elizabeth requests Dr. Waldman go with them to see Henry. It's a dark and stormy night at Dr. Henry Frankenstein's castle. Henry and Fritz are setting up equipment in a laboratory and on the roof. We see a table with a covered corpse on it. We learn it's a body that Henry stitched up from the parts of various people and contains the brain that Fritz stole. A knocking on the door interrupts them, and Henry reluctantly agrees to let Elizabeth, Victor, and Dr. Waldman in. Victor accuses Henry of being crazy, so Henry shows them what he's been working on. He said he started with animals, then he made a human heart beat for 3 weeks. Now he intends to give life to the stitched-up body. He raises it to the sky while the storm rages on and activates his equipment that's hooked up to the corpse. When the body is lowered, the arm starts moving around, and a crazy-eyed Henry shouts, "It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!" Victor and Elizabeth return home to the house of Baron Frankenstein, Henry's father. There's concern in the village because Elizabeth was supposed to marry Henry, and they prepared a celebration, but Henry is still away. Back at Henry's castle, he and Dr. Waldman are debating the ethics of Henry's experiment. Henry is quite pleased with what he's done, but looks a little concerned after Dr. Waldman tells him it was the abnormal criminal brain that was stolen. During the conversation, the corpse is referred to as a monster, so that's how I'll refer to it for the rest of this episode. A noise in the hallway alerts them to the presence of the monster. It awkwardly stumbles into the room, and we get our first look at its face. Henry shows Dr. Waldman what he's been teaching it. Fritz walks into the room holding a torch, and we learn that the monster is afraid of fire. It starts freaking out, and they're forced to restrain it and lock it in the cellar, where Fritz continues to torture it with a whip and the torch. This is a sad part of the movie because the monster has not done anything wrong, but it marks a big turning point in his behavior. I don't think it was ever made clear why Fritz hated the monster so much. I think he was just a cruel person and enjoyed tormenting what he saw as a being more lowly than himself. Henry and Dr. Waldman are interrupted from their studies by screaming. They rush to the noise, and we see the monster has killed Fritz by hanging him. The enraged creature then goes after them next. Henry agrees with Dr. Waldman that the monster must be destroyed. During a brief struggle, they manage to stick it in the back with a drug to knock it out. At that exact moment, Victor arrives and warns them that Elizabeth and the Baron Frankenstein are about to show up. They quickly move the unconscious monster out of sight and back into the cellar. Henry, who was weakened during the fight, is taken back home with his father, while Dr. Waldman is left behind in charge of the monster. We see him writing in a journal about needing stronger injections to keep the monster knocked out, but that he intends to dissect it as soon as possible. Unfortunately for Dr. Waldman, he doesn't move fast enough, and the monster gains consciousness and strangles him. It then wanders around the castle until he finds the front door and makes his exit. The day has finally come for Henry and Elizabeth to get married, and there's much celebration throughout the village, but Henry still looks a little bit troubled. Out in the country, we see the monster wandering around. He comes across little Maria, who is left home alone by her father. Maria takes the creature down to the water, and together they play with flowers. She throws the flowers in the water, and they enjoy watching them float. Sadly, the monster then gets the idea that he can throw Maria into the water and watch her float, which leads to her drowning. The terrified monster then runs away. Back at the Baron's house, Elizabeth tells Henry that she's frightened and wonders why Dr. Waldman hasn't arrived yet for the wedding. Victor rushes in at that point and informs him that Dr. Waldman has been murdered, and the monster was spotted out in the countryside. Then they hear the groaning noise the monster makes, and they fear it's in the house. In a poor attempt to keep Elizabeth safe, Henry locks her in her room while he and Victor search the house. Nobody considers the open window in Elizabeth's room, which the creature enters and attacks her, but she lives and the monster escapes. There's a commotion in the village as Maria's father carries her body to the burgomaster and says she's been murdered. Now the villagers are becoming an angry mob looking for justice. The angry mob is split into 3 groups, with Henry leading one, and they all charge into the countryside with torches blazing and hunting dogs howling. Henry becomes separated from his group and is confronted by the monster. The monster attacks and Henry is knocked out. With the mob approaching, it grabs Henry and carries him to a windmill, then barricades the door. When Henry wakes up, he tries to escape, but the monster catches him and flings him off the top of the mill down to the ground. The mob picks him up rather roughly for someone that just got tossed off the top of a windmill, and they take him away down to the village. With Henry out of harm's way, the mob sets fire to the mill. As it goes up in flames, the panicked monster has no place to go. He screams in anguish as the burning building collapses on top of him. That would have been a good place to end, but we get one last scene with the Baron's maids wanting to bring wine to Henry while he's recuperating in bed. The Baron does a toast with them, and that is the end. Kind of a funny little scene to finish with. I believe the original ending was supposed to be Henry dying in the burning windmill with the monster, but they wanted it to end on a little bit of a lighter note, so we get that last scene there. This is kind of a sad movie, and it's a bit chilling at the end listening to the monster scream as he's about to get burned alive. It makes you wonder how things would have played out if Fritz hadn't been such a jerk. And if Dr. Frankenstein had successfully been able to train the monster without Fritz's interference, what would his next step have been? He was obviously very ambitious, so I'd have to think he'd continue with his experiments. Maybe he'd keep repeating the process until he perfected it. Overall, it's a really enjoyable movie, a very memorable performance from Boris Karloff as the monster. He does a good job evoking sympathy from the viewers. It's kind of crazy to think that Frankenstein and Dracula are both almost 100 years old, and yet they still stand the test of time. If I had to rank the 3 movies I've covered so far, I'd probably go Wolfman, Frankenstein, and then Dracula. But all 3 are definitely still fun to watch. So now that I've covered each of their movies, I'll start to move on to the sequels and the eventual mashups involving all the characters. But that's all I've got for this week. I hope wherever you live, you're finally getting to enjoy some warm weather. I know we are here in Michigan, and it feels very nice. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time. Bye.